Hello and welcome to the first of 4 of the video lessons on the World War I stuff. This is broken into a couple of different areas in which they can ask questions about. In reality there are roughly 6 questions they can ask, but the last 2 lessons are combining 2 and 2. What we're going to be looking at across these next couple of lessons is how does World War I shape society, and politics in Britain. There's very little emphasis on military politics and military history, unless it directly affects the economy, society or politics. So what we're looking for when we're studying World War I is how does it continue and develop the long-term trends that have emerged since 1900. And does it create any new problems? And in reality, World War I doesn't really create any new problems in any way, shape or form. It's largely about exaggerating and stretching existing issues. So the usual disclaimer, this does not have the specific information. You need to get that from yourself. This is all about analysis. So if you look at what Britain was like before World War I, there are serious issues, serious problems confronting Britain. There is significant, as we saw, industrial strife, although it was dropping by 1914. But unions and employers still have an uneasy peace. Number of strikes have continuously increased. There is syndicalism in the air, although only the air of Glasgow and South Wales, admittedly. There is increased organisation, etc., etc. Additionally, there is social strife. Women are increasingly rebellious. There's increasing division between men and women, and within the Liberal Party, as well as between different groups in society, about the role of women, who represent obviously around 50% of the population. The Conservatives are splitting over tariffs. Labour, well, less so, are perennially split because being about several different parties all wrapped into one herd of cats. And the Liberals, again, the split between the Gladstonians and the New Liberals is always there and always present. Again, Ireland is almost in open civil war and is all full of chaos. There's economic stagnation and there's deep social inequality, which is making people angry. So you could argue, for all of these, a war would only aggravate this. The demands of a total war could, in theory, because it requires one to really push the Labour to do as much as possible. I mean, workers rather than the Labour Party. It could lead to more industrial strife, or because the government is weak, it might lead to unions taking advantage of this and pushing for more strikes. In fact, that's what ends Germany to some extent, is a series of strikes. Women can take this opportunity, or the fact that they will continue to be ignored because the government's focusing on the war, and aggravate their and develop their resistance. The demands of wars will lead to naturally splits within parties, as there's disagreements whether they should be in the war or not. That's the Liberal and Labour Party, and how the war is run. Ireland as well, it will very quickly get ignored, which could lead to violence and rebellion. Economic stagnation, the cost of war is huge, and so therefore, as the war continues, these economic problems could only get worse, and therefore social inequality can only get worse. So in theory, the war can easily make all these problems worse. And the war could, in theory, lead to profound economic consequences at home, profound negative effects on the civilians, and lead to political disaster, as it did with Germany in the end, and Russia as well, both of which had a complete regime change. In fact, the Ottomans as well, although that's a little bit more complex. Now, Britain doesn't have that. And so it's very important to understand why that is. Why, considering that there are all these issues, why don't these develop into a bigger issue? And that's the theme of many questions. And essentially, the reasons why Britain, despite these long-term divisions, actually becomes, at least on the surface, more unified, and actually in reality the divisions are not forgotten, but they're put to one side temporarily, is to do with the nature of World War I in Britain itself. So fundamentally, because although there are deep problems, there is very little in the way of revolutionary forces. Everyone believes that it should be democracy and it should be capitalistic, even on the left. Therefore, there isn't many people actually taking advantage of this situation to turn it into a revolutionary situation. And as well as that, people support the war by and large. They see it as a righteous war, and they also agree that it is a major threat. And so therefore they're prepared to sacrifice and unify and put aside differences and issues to some extent in order to win the war. Now, if the war is not seen as an existential threat or seen as a mistake of the British government and it's their fault, this can very quickly unravel into hatred, betrayal, and a resentment against the government, which will only make social and political problems worse. But more than that, the government itself is very good at making concessions in order to stop people getting upset, for groups in society getting politically restless, and therefore forcing them into the war. And I think without the government reasonableness and the government effort to try and make sure the poorest in society in particular are looked after, then we would not see the level of relative calm that we do. And likewise, the lack of the fact that the war is obviously bad, but there's no massive military disaster. Britain is not invaded. There isn't huge amounts of massacres, and there isn't huge amounts of military incompetence. The stuff about the Somme really happened after World War I. In fact, it happened after World War II, and the criticisms there. So at the time, there's nothing that people, apart from one or two events which you'll talk about, people can really point to and say, this war is being run badly by the government, and therefore we need to get rid of the government. So in reality, although there are long-term splits and long-term deep problems, and they will continue until after the war, people are prepared to put it to one side because ultimately they are not revolutionary and they are not a revolutionary force. People believe the war is important, they believe the war is righteous, and they believe the war is an actual threat, so they are happy or relatively happy to sacrifice to some extent towards that war. There is nothing the government is doing which goes out of its way to upset them. The government is trying its best to make people's situation relatively calm, relatively peaceful. And again, there's nothing happening in the war which makes people change their minds. They don't lose the war really at any point. And therefore that doesn't lead to pressure at home and people changing their mind and asking for peace and then division that causes. So the question we're going to be focusing on today, and that's in the background of most things, is why isn't there more unrest? Why don't people resist? Now this can also be framed on the exam paper as a how was life on the home front sort of question, and all the sources will lead you into it's bad, but actually that's not the case, and the answers to both those questions are the same thing. The reason there's not as much unrest is because civilian life is affected, but people accept some of the changes, and the other changes aren't actually that bad because the government does stuff to try and avoid them being too damaging. And that's the same answer for how is the home front affected. And then you say, well, clearly there's been massive government action, there's a huge change, but because the government is looking after people, because the government is trying its best to keep social stability and economic equality, more than it does actually before the war, then there is less people's experience, particularly the poorest people's experience, isn't actually that bad. So let's break it down. We're going to look at how the role of the government shifts, and then we're going to talk about how people's lives are affected economically. So there is an absolutely huge increase in the power of the states. And here are lots of different examples. You need to make sure you find the specifics of these on your own. All of these put together represent an unprecedented amount of control over people's lives, interruption in people's privacy, control over the economy, and to a level that certainly the Tories and probably even most liberals would not expect and accept in the radicalism of war. So you could say, well, perhaps this leads to all sorts of problems. The fact that people's private messages are read, the fact that people are forced into the army, the fact that the government is commandeering private land, is nationalising industry, is changing the time with British Standard Time, this sort of stuff. And you could say that this might lead to lots of hostility, but it doesn't. And this doesn't for two major reasons, but they're all essentially the one, which is the idea that people believe that this is necessary. At times, DORA is annoying to people. People see it as a bit too much. They see it as a bit too much snooping. They don't like it, etc. Particularly as the war goes on, it's seemingly won. There's demands for some of the controls reduce. But ultimately, most people believe that since the war is actually a pressing existential threat, and because the war is a righteous cause, and because they can kind of see the logic, even if they don't agree with it, of why this is necessary to help win the war, which is based around total war, mobilising resources to be as efficient as possible, and because they believe the government's stance that this is all temporary and it will go back to normal after the war, they are prepared to accept this. And it's not an accident that the people who would be most hostile to this are the right wing. But the right wing are also the most, quote unquote, at least in one definition of it, patriotic. And they're more willing to, they get more involved in the war, they're more supportive of the war. So naturally that leads them to be more supportive of things which, and privations, which lead them, which arguably help make the war be won quicker. So the people who will be really criticising and disliking this are the right, but since they are wrapped up in this idea of patriotic sacrifice for the war, they are less annoyed by this. And actually the left, although then they're less sold about the idea of the war being good, they quite like the idea of increasing government control. They see this as a relatively good thing. So in reality, yes, there's a huge annoyance, and they will have sources saying, oh, DORA is really bad, but really points out that there's no massive resistance to this in any way, shape or form. People resist conscription, but mostly on ideological grounds. And even those conscientious objectors, the vast majority are happy to work for the war in non-fighting capacities, such as stretcher bearers, which are often just as dangerous. There's only a very small minority who won't even do that. So clearly, although people are grumpy, because people are always grumpy, they do not fundamentally rebel against this. They do not resist this, because there's an understanding that this is necessary and this is temporary. So because of this, it's difficult to argue that the increase in government powers is negative for people's experience and causes lots of hostility. There is certainly grumpiness. There is certainly, people don't love it, but there is an unwritten understanding that this is ultimately necessary. And this is why we don't see any moves against this in any way, shape or form, any resistance to this in any way, shape or form. It helps that when the government does it, it does actually make a difference. So the government taking unprecedented control of industry and the Ministry of Munitions is justified on the basis of the shell crisis. And people go, well, it's crazy that they're taking so much power and so much control over industry, but there was the shell crisis, so we probably should have dealt with it. And then the fact that it works so well kind of reassures people that, okay, it's not that bad if it actually makes more shells. Same with nationalisation of railways and mines. Okay, so in reality, when we look at government powers, and you must get the specific examples from the reading for all of these, we do not see a pattern of real hostility. Minor annoyance really point out that the people who will be most annoyed about this are the right wing, but they are the most supportive of the war, so therefore that kind of cancels each other out. Now the economy is generally where they focus more, because there's more complexity to it. Once again, they will lead you up the garden path, and they will have lots of people saying bad things about how awful the conditions are. In reality, the story is, yes, conditions are more challenging, but because of the government action, and more importantly, the government action to make sure that the poorest in society are not disproportionately affected, actually, life does not change. In some cases, it actually gets better. And the people who are really hit are the upper middle classes, and even then, it's not too much. Basically, the government's approach is the war will lead to massive increases in costs, massive demands of labour to work, massive labour workers to work, massive demands and limitations on perhaps pay and that sort of stuff. But its approach is to go, well, we will not win this war if the public rebel against it, and if they force us to end the war, therefore. So therefore, although it will create a lot of economic hardship and a lot of demands, people must never have the impression that their circumstances are being massively affected, whereas others, the rich, are not. Because if the rich carry on having a lovely time, and the poor are the ones who suffer economically by wage cuts and price rises of foods, then there will be very easily the dynamic of poor versus rich. This is a rich man's war where the poor suffer, and there might be pressure on the government to then change. For example, in Germany, the Kaiser does not send his sons to fight, and there's a lot of pressure from the poor who say, well, this is a rich man's war, where the poor are sent to die. So essentially, the war does have a massive effect on the economy. The U-boat campaign, the submarines sink lots of food supplies, and even then a lot of the food supplies are lost through the fact you have to feed soldiers, and also by taking soldiers off the farms there are fewer people to actually make food. So the food supplies are limited, and then what naturally happens is if food supplies are limited, the price of food goes up. So food supplies are limited, wages are in theory limited, the amount that the government wants people to work is increased, the amount of control over people's lives is increased. But actually, when you look at the specifics, the government is at pains to make sure that the burden of this isn't too harshly felt on the poor, because that will lead to division and that will lead to rebellion. and resistance, and therefore weak morale at home, and therefore the war will end. And actually, if you look at the statistics, the death rate and death rate of poor people declines in this period. If you don't include the war, obviously loads of people get killed in the war, but death rate declines. Okay, because in reality, the government, while making people work harder and while there is price rises of food, simultaneously provides a lot of controls, a lot of welfare, and a lot of extra perks to balance that. And for some people, they are only ever so slightly worse off, not enough to make them annoyed, but particularly because they support the war. They believe the war is righteousness and they're winning the war. But also, for some people, actually life gets a little bit better. So in reality, for example, with the rise of the demand of factory work, people working in factories, and the increase in demand of people working in farms, as you get rid of a couple of million workers and they put them in the army, they need to be replaced. And also, as you need to make more factories because now you need to make far more guns than you were making before, you see a massive increase in the number of people employed, particularly women. This gives families two incomes, and even if they're not brilliant, you get income from your being sent home, from your husband being working in the army, and then you're working in a factory or an office. Fantastic, you now get two incomes. And so that will help balance the increase in what price rises. Likewise, as you said, under David Lloyd George, factory canteens are set up, which means that the feeding is on behalf of the government. Around 1 million people are fed by government canteens by the end of the war. And so what we have here is, again, the price rises might be happening, but poor people are insulated for that, at least one meal a day, because the government is taking over feeding them. Again, rationing is used later on, but still rationing is used, because if you just let the prices rise, what happens is that the rich can afford the food and the poor can't. If you have rationing, you say the food will cost this much and everyone can only have this much. And therefore that artificially keeps the price down. If you get one coupon to get it and the price is set, the prices won't rise as quickly. And the people who suffer for rationing are not the working classes. If anything, their diet improves. Their meat consumption declines because everyone's meat consumption declines because there's not enough animals, although bacon consumption does increase. But their amount of vegetables and bread actually increases during the war because the rations now make it affordable and available to get these things. And the people who suffer, the middle classes and upper classes, who would normally have more money and therefore buy more stuff and higher quality stuff, that's not available now. They have to get a ration, they have to get the same amount as everyone else. Now in reality this isn't quite true, because there is still a black market where you can buy extra food, etc., etc., and extra goods on the side, and the government's not very good at enforcing against that. And this means the middle class and upper classes still get their better quality food, because essentially what happens is if you've got 100 apples and half of them are not very nice, you sell the nice ones on the black market and the other 50% as part of rationing. That's how you make your money. So obviously they get nice quality food and more quality food, but at a cost. And also, yes, that's true, but the poor still are getting fed on average better than they were before the war. So having those sorts of rationing and price controls really helps keep it down. And that's similar to this idea about keeping price controls on other goods. For example, in order to keep the middle classes and upper classes happy, the bans on selling food and rationing were not applied to restaurants. Okay, restaurants were allowed to carry on selling food on the sly as they wanted. Now the problem with this is obviously all the rich people can afford to go to restaurants, and so what it might look like is that the government is allowing rich people to dine and dine and dine, and the poor who can't afford restaurants have to use rationing when there's still not enough food. The government is aware of this. So what they do is they say restaurants can do this, but they control the maximum price you can charge for the food in the restaurant. And so what they've done is they've turned something which could be controversial. The poor could look at and say, this is not fair, the government is helping the rich but not the poor. And they've turned it around. And suddenly, if you are a poor person, you can afford, reasonably, if you want to have a free-course dinner in the Ritz. Because the price controls made it so low that it was within reach, or reasonably within reach, with the working classes. So actually, yes, they've kept the middle class happy by allowing restaurants to continue, but they're at pains to make sure that the working classes are not alienated by making sure that there's they are not left out by this economic opportunity. Likewise, in some sectors, there is wages increase slower than the price rises of food, and so those people suffer. Coal to some extent, but actually coal is controlled by the government, so it's made up with all the perks such as the food providing canteens and that sort of stuff. The cotton industry does not. The cotton industry does really poorly in the war because it's dependent on exports. There's not much demand for cotton in the war. Yes, you need uniforms, but there's only so many uniforms you need. And the cotton industry is based on exporting goods. You can't export goods in a major war. All the ships are being used to transport food and war material, all being sunk. So you can't really do it. So they really suffer. So Lancashire does very, very, very poorly. Others, such as engineers and farm workers, people making stuff for war and making food, their pay goes up higher than labourers. And so then the wages and the prices even. And therefore, there you can say their life is actually, and their material interests are getting better. Now, in reality, when you take into account rationing and when you take into account price controls and when you take into account that actually people have to work longer, it's not like they have the best time ever. But the point we're trying to come across is, although it's not great, it's not terrible either. Life is, if anything, is gradually, a little bit, getting better in many ways, particularly economically. Okay, so in reality, although there are price rises and although there are limitations and although there is rationing, it is balanced by the lack of controls and government perks. For example, there's lots more opportunities for jobs for younger people. You can't join the army until you're, well, you can join at 16, but you can't, not on the front line until 17, 18. So you leave school at 12, and then you've got 6 years. Now, previously, you sort of didn't really do that much, did part-time, poorly paid work. But now the adults are in the army. You now take their jobs, and what happens is your money goes back to the family has more money. Likewise, there's more overtime because they're desperately trying to produce as many weapons, as many shells, as bullets as possible. The government encourages its workers not to take holidays and therefore get paid extra for working longer, and therefore they can have more money. And so the household income generally increases as time goes on. And similarly, there is an emphasis on making sure people are healthy, really coming down to that national efficiency stuff. And there's actually a fear that looking at the huge amounts of casualties that are happening in the war, what needs to happen is there needs to be an encouragement to make sure that the younger generation are fit and healthy, and also there is as more babies than there can possibly be, because they've already got an eye on replacing the massive manpower losses as a result of World War I. So there are midwives, creches, canteens, school meals, and all this stuff, which are designed, number one, towards the national efficiency. Number two, to provide people with perks, provide people with things that therefore they can put their children in so that they can work, and stuff basically to keep the workers relatively happy and, more importantly, productive. Happy workers who can put their child in a creche to work, who are given food by the government so they are insulated from price rises, are therefore more likely to work and likely to work harder, and that helps the war effort. So we could say, although the government's being kind, it's not necessarily being kind because it wants to be kind. It's being kind because all these perks, all these making sure price rises are not too damaging for the poor, mean that workers stay productive and are not rebellious, which helps the war effort. This is a war effort pragmatic decision. This isn't them trying out socialism during the war. So in reality, the story of the economy is, it's not as bad as perhaps, and certainly some of the sources will lead you. And if the sources come up and say it was terrible, attack them. Use specific knowledge. And there's, by the way, this is terrible amounts of detail. You need to look at this, the reading to get the specific evidence. Use the evidence to show actually how that's rubbish. The average poor of Britain ate better. Arguably had their income rise at roughly the same rate. If you include the double wages that your people are getting, the overtime and the children working, wages increase and income increases then faster than ever before, particularly amongst the poorest, unskilled working 20 to 30%. And actually life stays the same, if not gets a little bit better. It's bad in some ways, but that's offset by improvements in others. You can argue it's actually the middle classes and upper classes who really had to, because of rationing, because price rises increased but perks only helps the poor, actually had to pay more for fewer stuff. So their amount of stuff they got, the stuff that they're used to creature comforts and luxuries, are actually rarer and more expensive. So they suffer in terms of what they can consume. But in reality, within reason, like they are still better off than the poor. They are still not starving. But it's looking where the burden places, and the burden is not all on the poor. and that is a fundamentally political decision. So when you approach this question, particularly if it's got an economic bent, you must distinguish between, yes, X hurts workers, but Y compensates. And you really need to focus on this idea that they are deliberately trying to keep consent for the war by making sure that people's experience is not disproportionate depending on your class. So when we look at the summary, there's really not much evidence that there's a revolution or there is hostility towards the war. People fundamentally believe in the war, and underpinning everything else is that the people believe the war is a threat and the war is valid and righteous. Okay? If people believe that the government is in an illegal war, if people believe the government is in a war which is entered by mistake or the Britain shouldn't be in, then very quickly these annoyances about the economy or government controls give someone an issue to be angry about, and very quickly leads to hostility towards government. But because the war is seen as a good war, inverted commas, people support it and are prepared to accept a lot of limitations to their economic and rights, economic situation and their rights. But never underestimate, people are not jolly happy Oompa Loompas. They still criticise the government military actions, which is government of military actions, terrible grammar. They still criticise government actions. They still criticise what the elements of the controls, and they still grumble about how pay is not as great, and there will be grumbling the sources, but not. In reality, they do not really do anything about it, because ultimately people like to grumble, and it's not to an extent. The privation of rights, the loss of economic situation is not to the extent to make people really consider any active political opposition. And this is because while people are patriotic, the government also makes sure that they are in an economic situation where they are not annoyed, by getting rid of the worst excesses of the war, the worst economic effects of the war on people's lives, and making sure it's not simply a rich man's war where the poor suffer. Okay? So while there is a general feeling of amongst some people, oh, this is a bit over the top, this is a bit much effort, the government is getting too much involved, people generally accept it as necessary to win the war, and therefore there's only so annoyed they can get, and it does not translate into political opposition. Likewise, economically, most people don't have a terrible experience of the war. It's mixed with different classes, but arguably the very poorest do actually quite well, and it's the richer classes, particularly the upper working class and middle classes, who suffer a little bit more, but even then within reason they don't massively. So, and particularly as the war goes on after 1917, life gets even better as the convoy system is introduced, which we'll look at next, and all these sort of changes, and Britain basically starts to win the war. As Britain wins the war, there is more confidence, there's more money, there's more reliable shipping, and therefore things get a little bit better. The darkest days are 1915 and 1960. So, in fact, if that comes up in the source, have a look when the date is, because that will tell you a lot. Optimism 1914, Panic 1915, a slightly more grim quagmire 1916, 1917, 1918, Britain's winning. And the economic situation is improving because David Lloyd George is in charge. So, overall, nice and quick lesson. The story is increased civilian control of civilian life. It is grumbled about but accepted because of the war. There is economic bad effects, but they are mitigated by the government. The government takes out a lot of loans to pay for all of this, which is great in the short term, slightly bad in the long term. And therefore, ultimately, there is no hostility towards government action. And the thing you must always distinguish in the source, is this A, evidence of just grumbling as anyone will grumble about anything, or B, evidence of active political opposition? And in reality, yes, people grumble, but very, very few people are annoyed to the point on which they want the end to the war or the end of the government. If anything, they want the end of the government because it's not fighting the war properly, as we shall see in the next lesson. Okay, next we're going to be looking at the Liberal government during the war, and then moving on to the political consequences.